Hello again everybody, and welcome to my updated endgame build guide for Path of Exile, focusing on pushing the Ice Crash skill as far as possible. Before I get started, I should say that if you haven't watched the previous video, where we're at 30 million DPS, definitely watch that first, because everything in there is still relevant. It's a better starting point than this video, which is very focused on some expensive upgrades to really push the build quite far. As always, my most up-to-date path of building, filled with notes, my gear, my passive tree that I have at the moment, is in the description, and I'll be keeping it up-to-date all the time if I make any more changes. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the Echoes of Creation helmet. This thing is an insane damage boost. I mean, look at the numbers up there. It requires reshuffling a bunch of stuff, but the upside is enormous. It is a massive damage boost, and I'll talk about each of the attributes of it in turn here. So whenever we attack, we actually hurt ourselves, but the reward for that is that we do 15% more damage for every Warcry exerting our attacks. We use at least 7 endurance charges for this build, and in my previous video I talked about how we keep those up at all times using a cluster jewel setup. That's really important to have here, so that when you first enter a map, you just press one button, you have all your endurance charges giving you big damage reduction. You can't just walk into a room and slam an ice crash down 3 or 4 times in a row when there's nothing around you. You fully can kill yourself with this helmet on. As long as you're hitting a few targets, even just one target of course for boss fights, you will leech the life back, but you're going to be topped back up to full. And then if you've got this Warcry Mastery down here giving you life back as well, that's going to help offset these problems. So someone on the Path of Exile forums noted that if you socket your auto exertion setup in here, it doesn't actually do anything. Now Path of Building is going to tell you that you have massive damage numbers, maybe even 20% higher than what my screenshot here is showing you. It is lying. If you use an auto exertion setup in your helmet, the cooldown is exactly the same as if it was in any other helmet. This line at the top here does absolutely nothing. So instead, what I'd recommend is you put your dual curse setup in here. It's really nice quality of life, because with Battle Mage's Cry having another charge, you can keep the crit buff up more often, and more importantly, it gives us 15% of life back when you Warcry much more consistently. Again, look at the damage numbers here. This thing is not to be missed out on. It is absolutely huge. So problem number 2 with the new helmet is going to be mana issues. If you had a rare helmet before this, you probably had a implicit on it that gave you better mana reservation efficiency of your skills. You won't have access to that anymore. You also might lose out on int and resists and all sorts of stuff like that. So you're going to have to tweak around with your passive tree. So with that, you can pick up this cluster jewel right here, and this will really help your mana issues. The key lines to look for here are having Spiteful Presence on the cluster jewel. It always comes with increased mana reservation efficiency of skills, which is really good. And then you can even look for getting something like this, 35% increased effect. With this setup, I was able to drop the mana mastery that I've shown over here. I did not need it anymore because Spiteful Presence is making your Hatred aura cost way less mana. If you still have problems after that, like you're constantly running into mana issues, I would recommend just dropping one auto-exerted Warcry from your setup for now until you can fix them somewhere else. You can always get implicit corrupted modifiers on rare jewels that give you mana reservation efficiency, things like that. There are lots of ways to get this. Just get to a point that it feels comfortable. It's more important than running out of mana. You never ever want to run out of mana on this build. So I'll quickly talk about each of the gems and the links that we're using again. Everything is fairly similar to the previous video in here. You'll notice that I have a lot of level 21 gems now. This is just squeezing out as much damage as you can possibly get. The big one though is that I have swapped out Awakened Cold Penetration, which was giving us a lot of damage and more importantly cold exposure on our enemies, for Awakened Melee Physical Damage. Now this thing, even without cold exposure, does more damage. However, obviously we'll want the best of both worlds, so I'll talk about how we've got cold exposure back into the build in a bit. But this is kind of what my setup looks like here. A couple other things to note. I have down leveled my Frostbite setup. Level 10 matches it with the int requirement of a level 21 Ice Crash gem. I've also down-leveled my cast when damage taken setup using a level 2 or 3 cast when damage taken with Blood Rage and Molten Shell matching the level requirement here. So that comes out to about level 8. This feels really good for me. Molten Shell's always up, giving you armor. Play around with this as you desire. So next up, I want to talk about some tattoos that I've been experimenting with. We've got this one at the top here, the Tattoo of the Tukohama Warrior. This gives your melee hits which stun a 5% chance to fortify. Before, I had fortify as a implicit modifier on my chest piece, but obviously we have really good options here, like having hatred give us even more damage, essentially. So if you just slap a couple of these things on your build anywhere, they don't have to be where I'm showing them here, it just looks pretty. But if you just slap these anywhere, you can pick up a much better implicit modifier. Don't put too many of these on your tree. I've seen people do that before, just tattooing everywhere. We still need lots of strength to give us lots of life and damage on the tree. So just 2 or 3 of these, I think, is a really good spot to have. So now let's talk about a very expensive upgrade here. This is the Bottled Faith Flask. Definitely not needed until you get right into the end game. A diamond flask is going to do you absolutely fine and cost you 1 chaos rather than this thing. But when you can pick this up, it's really nice. It gives you a massive crit chance buff against any enemies that are on your consecrated ground. And also, you do 40% more damage. I'd probably recommend using an Enkindling Orb to give it increased effect. Because you only really want to be popping this for boss fights or big rare enemies. You're not going to need it for when you're mapping around. So yeah, again, huge expensive upgrade. This should be one of the last things you're looking at. So just want to quickly note here that on your rings, you want to be juicing up as much elemental damage as possible. Also note that you might not need 2 of this craft at the bottom here. Just have a play around with your build and see where your mana feels comfortable. So a key way that this build scales in the end game is with crit multiplier. So if you look up here, basically every single jewel that I use is going to have as much crit multiplier as physically possible on it. You can normally pick up at least 3 and then another relevant stat like area damage, resistances, intelligence, things that you might need for the build fairly cheaply on the trade website. These jewels are really big upgrades and they are worth the money. So I mentioned earlier that we take out Awakened Cold Penetration, and we don't have a form of cold exposure anymore. So I really wanted to add that back in because it was a very big damage buff. So let's start talking about what this thing does. Please note that it is going to be very expensive if you set it up correctly. This node here that I have highlighted gives you a 25% chance to apply cold exposure whenever we hit something, which is really good. That's even better than the Awakened gem we had before. If you look up here, we've also got another node, which will be Blanketed Snow, and that gives us 10% cold penetration as well. So really powerful. The main reason that I like having another cluster jewel is we get another jewel socket up here that we can use for rare jewels for more crit multiplier. Please note that if you're getting a very well set up cluster jewel, it's going to be expensive because this node at the back here needs to be the skill down here that you are not using. So in my example, this node back here is called Widespread Destruction. It's still a good node, don't get me wrong, but we don't want to take it because we're point starved on the tree. So it's very important that you get that at the back and the 2 skills that you actually want at the front. I've had to play around with the Ascendancies to try and work out what works the best for this build, and this is kind of what I've come up with so far. I'd say you always want to take this node here, which is called Unbreakable. It's just such a big defensive boost that it's hard not to like it. Unstoppable is fairly mandatory at this point because we need to use rare boots rather than Calm's Roots unique, so you're going to have to pick that one up. If you need accuracy, so when you're leveling or if you're just having accuracy problems in general, definitely take this node up here called Undeniable. This will fix your accuracy problem, especially if you're using the Oscarm gloves. It's just fantastic. If you want the most damage, I would recommend Unyielding. You get more area of effect, you get more damage per endurance charge. It's just really nice. I've been wanting to get this back in the build for quite some time. However, if you need more defenses, stay with this node down here. This one called Unrelenting is a really nice defense buff. It gives you more elemental and physical damage reduction, so definitely don't lose out on that. In short, here you kind of take what your build needs at this point in time, whether it's accuracy, defenses, or damage. I want to give an honorable mention to this tincture here. This gives you a huge damage buff, but at the cost of taking a mana drain that ramps up over time. Personally, I wanted to get to 100 million DPS without having to use this, as I don't like what it does to our playstyle. I find this interrupts the smooth flow of mapping and boss fights, honestly, and running out of mana can lead to you dying. Because if you can't Ice Crash, you can't leech the health back, and then, yeah, that's when you're in trouble. So this thing's very strong, have a play around with it. Again, crazy numbers, but yeah, I personally just don't like it. And that's everything from me. There's still huge room to scale this build. For example, my weapon isn't actually that good. It could be upgraded, it would be expensive, but it could be upgraded to give up to 40 or even 50% more damage if you're good at farming currency, just on its own. So like, there's a lot of runway for improving more damage, more defenses if you wanted to. I'm only level 95 in the game as well. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions about the build or Path of Exile in general, please consider leaving a comment or joining my Discord, where I'm always active and able to help people out. Yeah, thanks everybody.